Good morning from my shamefully neglected edible backyard. It's been a while since we filmed video in this space, and part of the reason is the state of the garden. We've been concentrating our efforts on our quarter-acre plot, which is 5 kilometers away from our house, and our little backyard has not been getting the love and attention that it deserves. It's early March, so there's still a window of opportunity for some serious maintenance, and I might film a video about that. However, it's not a topic of today's video. Since it's the beginning of a new gardening season and International Women's Day today, I thought I would talk a bit about the women garden writers that have inspired me the most on my gardening journey, in my writing and in my designs. I've even been lucky enough to meet some of my heroes, or rather heroines, so I have little stories about that. But it's a little chilly outside, so let's head inside, make a cup of tea and talk about books. So I got my tea in a mug that I got from my daughter. Can you read what it says? I garden, therefore I am. It's probably very appropriate for me. And I made elderflower tea from the flowers that we dried last year. I always think that elderflower tea is something like a love letter from the summer. So first, let me tell you what I look for in gardening books. Firstly, of course, it's expertise that is based in many years of hands-on experience. But I also love when the information is well presented in well-organized manner, not chaotic. And I am a sucker for good writing. But what's most important for me is kind of a creative and joyful approach to gardening. If you want a book that will tell you how to grow carrots, there are probably hundreds of those around, and they're largely interchangeable. And it's definitely important to have a good reference book, but that's not what I mean when I talk about books that inspire me. Even though I garden to grow food, which might seem rather prosaic, I think that the productive space can and maybe even should be beautiful too. For me, gardening is not only a way to provide healthy and nutritious food for my family, but it's also a creative outlet. And my garden is not only my pantry, but also my playground. So let's get into the books, and I would like to start with Joy Larkom, whom I consider kind of grande dame of vegetable gardening. I have 4 of her books. I think those are all the books that she wrote, I think. And the most basic one on my kind of desert island gardening book is Grow Your Own Vegetables. And this is kind of a reference book, but it is more than that. It has a great information on different gardening techniques, on things like composting, prolonging the season, using row covers, like anything you can think of. And then there is info on specific vegetables, and it gives you like different ways to grow them. For example, closer spacing for smaller vegetables, or different times that you can grow them for prolonging the harvest period and things like that. And at the end is an article that she wrote for the Kitchen Garden magazine, I think, which is called Mind the Gap. And it's about how to plan and sow and garden so that you have enough to eat from the garden, even during the so-called hungry gap in early spring. But there's more. She also wrote sort of a definitive guide to Oriental vegetables, and I've been inspired by this a lot. For example, for trying all kinds of vegetables that were not familiar to me, but also, for example, in designing my Oriental polyculture. Then there's her book, The Organic Salad Garden, with beautiful photographs by Roger Phillips, and it's about basically anything you can think of that you could use in a salad. It's here. It's edible flowers, wild plants, anything. So sort of like any new book I see coming out on the subject, it does not surpass this book. And then creative vegetable gardening, which is probably has been most inspiring for me, and it's about what I talked about, the creative approach to growing vegetables, growing edibles. It contains several garden plans, like examples of how you can design with vegetables, and there's also a list of different edibles, not just annual vegetables, and from the point of view of their ornamental value as well. And I think this was sort of a direct inspiration behind my potager garden that I had for 2 years, and it was a 3 by 5 meter garden with 4 beds and one central one with a bean teepee, where I played with color, with different shades of yellow on one side and different shades of yellow and orange, and then red and purple on the other side. I met Joy Larkom at one of the garden festivals. I think it was, I don't remember whether it was in the net. I think it was in Belgium at the Kasteel Hex, where she gave a talk on growing salads, mainly through the cut and come again method that she writes a lot about, and that I also like to use in my gardens. And she was really like just a nice person. So that's always nice when you meet your heroes and they don't disappoint you. What Joy Larkom is in the UK, I think Barbara Demroche is kind of the US counterpart. I have 3 of her books, which I think is also about everything that she wrote, and they're incredible. Like this one, Garden Primer, it's massive. How many pages is it? It's like almost 800 pages, and it's not only about edible gardening. It's also about growing ornamentals, and she has lots of experience. She even she worked for years at a nursery, and then she ran the 4-season farm together with her husband Elliot Coleman. So like there's little she doesn't know, and she is an incredible writer. She's my favorite garden writer. So this is a bit of a reference book, but then she also wrote Theme Gardens. And it's this one is more about design, and here are several, I don't know how many, quite many, maybe 15 gardens that she designed around certain themes, like fragrance garden or butterfly garden with plants that attract butterflies, but also things like Shakespeare garden, which is all about plants that are mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. So I love this kind of creative approach. And lastly, I have the book, the 4-Season Farm Gardener's Cookbook, which she co-authored with her husband, Elliot Coleman. But as they told us when we interviewed them, Barbara did most of the work. The first part of the book is about gardening, and the second part is all recipes based on homegrown produce. And as I said, I was lucky enough to interview both of them when we traveled to the US in 2019, when our daughter went to study in Canada, and we decided to travel with her so that we could see where she was for the semester. And I kind of diverted the trip because I so wanted to meet my heroes that we decided to fly to Boston and then take a road trip to Canada, to Kingston, where Esther was going to study. And on our way, we visited the 4-Season farm. And both Barbara and Elliot were super kind and welcoming. They showed us around. They even invited us for lunch. They are so knowledgeable and witty and wonderful people. It was really a treat to be able to meet them. And after that, I wrote an article about the 4-Season farm and the interview for the magazine, the Tuin op Tafel, the Dutch magazine that at the time I was chief editor of. Another American author, gardener and author, is Rosalind Creasy, and her like most important book, I think, is Edible Landscaping. I think it's, as far as I know, the best book on designing gardens with edibles. It has a big section on design and how to approach it from the point of view of using edibles in the landscape, both perennial plants, fruit trees, bushes, and also annuals. And then there is sort of encyclopedia which tells you about each plant individually, about how to grow them, how to use them in the kitchen, how to use them in the landscape, and even suggesting some interesting varieties. Rosalind Creasy also wrote a series of books called The Edible Garden, and I have 3 of them. I would love to have all of them, but they have been printed some time ago, so it's not always easy to find them. I've got Edible Salad Garden, Edible Flower Garden, and Edible Mexican Garden. All of them super inspiring, with lots of information about plants, but also a section on how to use them in the kitchen. So I always love when books have this connection from sort of garden to table. It's also the inspiration about my recent video in December, Week of Eating from the Garden. And most specifically, the Edible Mexican Garden was an inspiration behind my Mexican polyculture that I designed for one of our beds. Even though our climate is a bit different, because Rosalind Creasy is in California, as far as I know. And unfortunately, I was not able to divert our US trip as far as that. I would have loved to meet her as well, but that was not possible, unfortunately. But I have been using her ideas in my gardens, or rather, using them as inspiration for my own designs. Then let's go back to the United Kingdom, and another of my favorite authors, Sarah Raven. This is the first book of hers that I read. I first borrowed it from the library, a local library, and then I bought it because I wanted to have it. It's called The Cutting Garden, and it's mostly about flowers, about growing cut flowers, and I definitely love to do that as well. I will be expanding my cut flower garden this year, and I will be making videos about that. But there is also there are several sort of designs that, like example designs, and one of them is called the Family Garden, and it is a mix of edibles and flowers, and that's something that I find super exciting and inspiring, and something that sort of is what our food forest is like. We have fruit trees, but we have lots of flowers under them, and I approach it from the permaculture design view. So I look at the functions of the plants besides their ornamental value. So we have primarily flowering plants that attract pollinators or other beneficial insects, but it is essentially what Sarah Raven's design in this book is as well, even though her approach is mostly sort of concerned with the ornamental value. It will work in the same way as our garden does. But Sarah Raven has also written books that are about growing vegetables, growing edibles, such as The Great Vegetable Plot. Unfortunately, I no longer have the cover. But this also is a beautiful book, and it's with wonderful photographs by Jonathan Buckley, who has become her go-to photographer, and I think he has definitely contributed a lot to Sarah's books. And he also photographed this one, which has been used so much that it's totally falling apart, and it's called the Garden Cookbook. And again, it's a cookbook for gardeners. It's organized by seasons, and you get lots of inspiration for cooking with your homegrown produce, but also with some wildflower plants, wild edibles. When I started reading Sarah Raven's books, of course, I was super inspired and also wanting to grow all of the things that she was growing in her gardens. And she has also a web shop or seed company, but they only ship within the UK, I think. And I so wanted to see the garden that I thought, well, maybe I could volunteer there. So on their website there was information for you were welcome to volunteer. But I think they only meant like volunteering for a couple of hours on a day. But I wrote in and I asked whether I could come volunteer for a week. And I got a response from from Bea Andrews, who was back then a head gardener in the beautiful garden at Perch Hill. And she said, yeah, sure, come. I think it was in 2005 in June, and my children back then were 5 and 3 years old, and it was the first time that I sort of went to do something for myself, and it was a total working in a garden was a total vacation for me, and it was so wonderful. Bea had been so kind and hospitable. I remember that the evening that I arrived, she picked me up on the train station, and then we walked through the garden. She showed me around. She picked some asparagus and rhubarb, and she made rhubarb crumble and asparagus risotto for dinner, and it was just the best time. By the way, Bea went on to start her own business. She has a floral design studio and works with locally grown, sustainably grown seasonal flowers. She also grows some of them herself, and her Instagram account is definitely worth checking out. The last time I visited Perch Hill Farm was in 2018, I think, and I was to take a course with Sarah Raven on the subject of color in the garden. She's also a wonderful teacher in person, and I think color in the garden is also the topic of her upcoming book, which I'm very excited for. And last but not least, author of not that many gardening books, Susan Campbell. I have her book, A History of Kitchen Gardening, and this is such a incredibly informative, well-researched, beautifully presented book. I think the cover does not do it justice. Susan Campbell was first a painter and illustrator, and she made illustrations for this book herself, and they're so wonderful. I'm so sorry I can't show them to you because of copyrights. But of course, most important is the information, the amount of information in this book. And I can't imagine the amount of research that went into this. And you might think that walled kitchen gardens, which is the topic of this book, of large country estates, are not something that is very relevant for urban gardeners. But that's not true at all. The gardeners back in those days have invented so many ways to prolong seasons in the times before refrigeration. They grew such a variety of crops, and there are things like making hotbeds or making use of the warmth of the microclimates created by walls and fences, which is something that is very relevant for urban gardeners. And I have really gotten a lot of inspiration from this book. Apart from it being a great read. I have not met Susan Campbell yet, and she's 89, I think, but maybe I can still make it happen. She has also co-founded the Walled Kitchen Garden Network that are currently running an online symposium that I found out about too late, but I will still see whether I can register for the last 2 events. So those were my heroes, my big inspirations, and I am very much hoping that my own book, Edible Paradise, will also become for other people what these books have been for me. I will put a link to all those books that I mentioned, as far as they're still available, down in the description box, as well as a link to my own book, so please check them out. And it would be great if you could, in the comments, share garden writers, especially women garden writers, that have inspired you. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon. Happy gardening!